Hello and welcome to The Reasonably Good Life. I'm your host, Dr. Mike Brooks. This is a show about using reason to pursue the good life in this complicated world. We're on episode 5, which is, why does it always seem like it's the end of the world, even when it's not?
Now a quick word about the Reasonably Good Life sponsor, Pinwheel. Pinwheel is a phone designed to be a smarter phone for kids and teens. It's a tool and not a toy. It has the most useful features of smartphones without all of the trappings that concern parents. I've served as a consultant for the development of Pinwheel, and my 10-year-old has one and loves it, and my wife and I love it too. If you go to pinwheel.com and order a phone, you can get a 10% discount by using this code, Brooks10. That's spelled out T-E-N, and it's all one word, Brooks10. Now, back to the Reasonably Good Life.
If you've been reading the news at all, it's hard not to see the news in today's technological society. We're getting constant, streams with social media and shares and, people sending us things. Is this avalanche of negative news? It feels like we're in some weird doom spiral. A particular song comes to mind, a refrain, the chorus comes to mind. And I've said I'm a huge U2 fan. I'm also a huge REM fan. And this song you might have heard on the radio. It's been around since the 80s. But let's take a listen to REM's song and see how it pertains to today's episode.
It's the end of the world as we know it. It's the end of the world.
It's the end of the world as we know it, but I feel fine. I'm going to make a case for REM nailed it in this song, probably more than they thought. And I'm going to make an argument for that. So all respect to REM for nailing it with their song. It's the end of the world as we know it, but I feel fine. In that song, Michael Stipe in a rapid fire pace sings about all the negatives that have been going on during the time. And then he goes to the refrain, it's the end of the world as we know it, but I feel fine. And when we look at the news, we get a rapid fire of all the different things that are going on. And I am not here to say that there are not problems in society. Of course, we have some very significant problems. These are not to be swept under the rug. We do have to deal with these. And let's start with COVID. For the past year and a half, we've been dealing with this pandemic. We've had in America almost 650,000 people died across the world. It's about 4.5 million people have died. We've dealt with quarantines and lockdowns and wearing masks and social distancing and businesses open and closing and some having to shutter their doors permanently, economic hardship, wildfires. We've had the murder of George Floyd and then all the protests that broke out across America. We've been dealing with polarized America, a contentious election, an insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th, mass shootings. In Texas, we had a blizzard. We'd call it a blizzard, but it was just for a week. We were snowed in almost across the whole state, and that was just not something that we could imagine. I've never seen anything like it here in my over 30 years of living in Austin, Texas. We've had recently the collapse of the government in Afghanistan after being there 20 years trying to stabilize the country. Homicide rates in America have increased by 25% over the last couple of years. Increased mental health issues. There's more depression and anxiety. It's more widespread than it's been in some time. And then in our schools, as the schools are opening back up, not only are we having to deal with the Delta variant, just when we thought it was safe to go back into the water, now we have the Delta variant. We're back up to 1,000 people plus in America dying each day because of COVID. A lot of ICU beds are filled up. As schools are going back during the Delta variant, there's arguments over, mask mandates. And then you have critical race theory is another hot button issue that's causing a lot of contention and strife in school districts. Black Lives Matter, social justice issues, and it's our polarized America. Our schools are becoming more polarized, so we're seeing all this breakout, and it's like, how much can we take? Are we going down the tubes? Now, I have a question for you, and I want you to really think about this. Let's forget the news for just a second. And just think, if someone were to ask you, and well, heck, I'm asking you, if the world were getting better or worse, how would we know it? What metrics would we use? What would we look at to determine, is the world actually getting better or worse? So when we think about that in a calm state of mind, when I present on this and I ask audiences, people say stuff, well, we'd be healthier, we'd live longer, we'd be happier, stuff like that, right? That comes to mind. Well, let's take a look at the data, right? To see where things are going. We need to stop and look at the actual data. Now, Steven Pinker, he's a psychologist at Harvard University, all-around brainiac. He wrote a book on this very topic. He's also got a TED Talk on it. So I'm very much inspired by Dr. Pinker, who helped give me more hope than I had before I read his book and saw his TED Talk. His book is Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. Wonderful book, great TED Talk too, if you want to check it out. Now, for you podcast listeners, you might want to see the video version of this, because I'm going to go over a lot of charts. I'll try to describe them for listeners, but it might be helpful to look at them. Now, I'm going to start with a cartoon, though, to kind of put things in perspective, and I'll describe the cartoon. It's a grandson in a reclining chair with his grandfather. The grandfather's reading the paper, and the son says, "Grandpa, do you remember the good old days?" Grandfather says, "I sure do, only we didn't call them the good old days back then." The grandson says, "What did you call them?" Grandfather says, "We called them these trying times." And this cartoon's from a strip called Pickles by Brian Crane. So I love this little cartoon because it really captures it. And another quote that captures this is, "There's nothing more responsible for the good old days than a bad memory." And that's, as near as I can tell, Franklin P. Jones was the first person who expressed this idea. So oftentimes when we look at things, it seems like, things are going to hell in a handbasket. But if we step back and really look at it, the history, human history, is absolutely brutal. We do have some serious things going on right now, but when we step back and look at it through the lens of history, things don't seem so bad. So historically, life was really rough. We had food scarcity, famines were rampant. A lot of people died of starvation, diseases, plagues, wars, pandemics. They had no central heating or cooling, so even in the snowpocalypse in Texas, it sucked that a lot of us lost power. But think back, 100, 200 years plus, people didn't have any heating, air conditioning, even electricity. No plumbing, showers, hand washing, like germ theory. They didn't even know germ theory till relatively recently. There's a high infant and child mortality rate throughout most of human history, no birth control. Most people were uneducated, so very few people were literate throughout most of modern history. I mean, go back long enough, there weren't any books, or no one was literate. Democracy is a relatively new idea. So throughout most of human history, there were monarchies and tyrannies and aristocracies and things like that, but there were very few democracies throughout history. Slavery was common throughout most of human history. Limited human rights, limited women's rights. In America, we had the Jim Crow laws that severely restricted what Black Americans, African Americans could do, where they could go, water fountains and restaurants and hotels and back of the bus, all that stuff. We had limited information available to us. And now in this internet age, we have, at our fingertips, so much information, too much information. A lot of political instability throughout history. Like if you think of Europe, they were at war with one another throughout most, for many, many hundreds of years. Limited systems of justice, and also limited entertainment options. You think of all the things we have available at our fingertips, it boggles the mind compared to most of human history. Now, I am going to do something a little different than some of my previous episodes. I am going to share the screen and I'm going to show you some slides. And again, for podcast listeners, I will describe them as best I can, but I welcome you to look at the YouTube video for this. So I'm going to go to share screen. All right, now I'm sharing the screen with you, and this ought to drive home the point that things aren't as bad as they seem. So one thing we can look at is poverty levels. Poverty levels have gone way down over the last few hundred years. Throughout most of human history, people were very impoverished. In fact, about 90% of the world lived in extreme poverty as far back as about 200 years ago. So in the last 200 years, poverty levels have dropped massively. So right now in this world, there's only about 9% of the world lives in extreme poverty. So just looking at poverty levels, we have it's a lot better than it used to be, way better. Even the U.S. poverty rate has dropped. If you look at this graph, I want to say that many of these graphs are from our worldindata.org. So the previous one was. This one is from a U.S. Census Bureau, this figure on the U.S. poverty level. And the U.S. poverty level has gone way down. Now, it's about half of what it was in 1959, and it's gone down even less since then after the government did the PPP to help people from the pandemic. So U.S. poverty rate has gone down. I don't have it, but during the Great Depression, our poverty level was out the roof. Now, there are more Americans living in poverty in general, but that's because the U.S. population rate has gone up. But our poverty rate has generally gone down and isn't just, spiking up, despite what most people think. If we look at life expectancy, another great metric, people are living longer across the globe. And if you go back even 100 years ago or more, and throughout most of human history, people only lived about 35 years old on average. And, now in many Western countries, people live well into their 70s as an average. Even in Africa and in some less developed countries, the average life expectancy has gone way, way up. So that is great news and significant progress. Another metric we might look at if we were to ask, is the world getting better or worse? Child and infant mortality rates. What a horrible thing, absolutely horrible thing to lose a child. One of the worst things that could ever happen to a person, probably the worst, is losing a child. Throughout most of human history, child and infant mortality, or, kids died very frequently. So about a third of kids didn't even live to see their first year of life, and almost 50% or the high 40% didn't even live to be 15. So if you think of that level of tragedy of losing a child, that was so much more common throughout history. But now the child and infant mortality rate is just a tiny fraction of what it used to be. And you can only imagine the level of suffering that caused throughout most human history of people losing their kids. Just horrible. So we need to be very thankful that the child and infant mortality rates have gone way, way down. even when we look at pandemics, and we do have this pandemic to deal with, and it is bad and has caused unimaginable suffering. My 10-year-old, when the pandemic broke out, he said, "Dad, did you have to deal with a pandemic when you were young?" It's like, nope. We did have AIDS, and that was very scary, but it's still different than what we're dealing with COVID. But if you look throughout history, pandemics were quite common, and the amount of death they caused, the sheer numbers were way worse than what we're dealing with now. So, we've all heard of the Black Death, the bubonic plague that killed about 200 million people. About a third to a half of Europe died during the medieval period when it broke out. Smallpox during its last 100 years killed about 500 million people. And if you've ever seen pictures of someone with smallpox, I mean, it's absolutely horrible. So people who survived, it was very disfiguring. And when you got it, extremely, extremely painful. So much suffering throughout human history has been caused by smallpox, which had about a 30% infected fatality rate. By comparison, COVID has about a 0.5% or somewhere around there. The Spanish flu 100 years ago killed about 50 million people across the world. Importantly, COVID's 4.5 compared to 50. Well, that was when the world had about 1/4 of the population that it does now. So that's the equivalent of about 200 million people dying about a century ago from the Spanish flu. That boggles the mind. That's, America has 330 million people. So that would be most of America, the equivalent of, but this is worldwide. I think it was like 675,000 in America, but again, adjusted for, we only had like a third or a quarter of the population back then. If we look at homicide rates across Western Europe, they have gone way, way down. In Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now, I think he said that in medieval Europe, it had about 45 times the homicide rate that Western Europe has now. So again, it used to be very brutal in most of human history. Homicides are still a problem, and in some areas of the world, much more than others. However, through the long lens of history, it's not as bad as it used to be. In America, the homicide rate I mentioned has gone up 25%. Now, again, if we look at a longer time frame, the homicide rate has gone down. In the 90s, it was a lot higher than it is now, even with the uptick that we've had in recent years. We don't have good data on what the homicide rate was in America, 100, 200 years ago, if you go back too far, and people didn't collect good data back then. However, in general, it's gotten a lot better. And there you can see that the homicide rate has gone way down. If you're a podcast listener, you can see it's up about twice of what it was in the 90s, early 90s. It was about twice as what it was until recently. And then it's had this uptick of about 25% increase, but still way lower than at the highs. And then America, if we look at compared to Western countries, we have a much higher homicide rate. So when it comes to, being great, America is great in many, many ways. But if one measure of greatness is having a low homicide rate, we're not the greatest country on earth there. We have some work to do. That'd be a whole nother podcast. But at any rate, it's still better than it used to be. Now, another way we would look at, is the world better or worse, is happiness, right? Are people happier now than they used to be? If we go back far enough, we don't have any data on the happiness of people 200 or 300 years ago. We've only been collecting data on happiness for the last several decades. I would say that we have good data on happiness. And I have a graph here. And then again, this is from, I believe I got this from, Our World in Data. Great website, ourworldinData.org. Lots of neat things to look up, lots of charts and graphs to put things in perspective. But most countries, the citizens of most countries rate themselves as fairly happy now, especially in more Western countries and Japan, more developed countries. Of course, Afghanistan or Syria, there's, hot spots all throughout the world, but again, fewer than there used to be. So most people rate themselves as fairly happy. And if you look at this chart, and it has generally gone up over the past few decades. You wouldn't know that from watching the news, right? You'd think, we're going to hell in a handbasket. Another way of asking about happiness, instead of just saying, are you happy or not, is life satisfaction. How satisfied are you with your life overall? Slightly different way of getting at some of the same data, or, looking at it, slightly different ways. Life satisfaction. Again, we find life satisfaction generally, people are fairly satisfied throughout most Western countries. They rate themselves as fairly satisfied with life, and that it's generally gone up. Again, not across the board, not every country. Greece has had troubles, and there's many hot spots throughout the world, but happier than we used to be, more satisfied than we used to be with life, and it's generally gone up over time in most countries. Even Americans, the average American, and this may be surprising, if I ask you, rate your life satisfaction 0 to 10 right now, not this moment, how you feel, but think about just overall how satisfied you are with your life from 0 to 10. Think about your number, 10 being the highest. What would you rate it? You could, if you're watching the YouTube, you could put it in the comments, maybe, but most Americans would rate themselves as fairly satisfied. And that might seem surprising. And now with the pandemic, it's gone down a little, but if I'm looking at this Gallup poll and the graph that goes with it, even a year ago, pre-pandemic, it got up to 90% of Americans rated themselves as fairly satisfied with their lives. And it's gone down to 82%, but still, that's, it's fairly high. And I mean, we're in a pandemic, so of course, we're not as satisfied as we used to be. It's still very high. Now, here is a really weird one. And I, come across this through Steven Pinker's work, and then Our World in Data. I found this really great graph on the perceived happiness gap. And for podcast listeners, I'll explain it. For you viewers, you can look at the graph here. Is if you ask people in most countries, how satisfied with life are you? How happy are you overall? In most countries, especially the developed, more Western and stable countries, they'll rate themselves as very happy. But if you ask, how happy do you think the average citizen of your country is, people will rate it a lot lower. And this happens across the board. In every country, people rate their own life satisfaction as much higher than they would the average citizen of their country. And just for an example, because this is an extreme one, in South Korea, about 90% of people would rate themselves as happy or very happy. But when you ask those Koreans, the South Koreans, how many people in your country do you think will rate happy to very happy? They say about 25%. So this huge gap, 90% versus 25%. And again, this happens throughout the world. Another is, are people optimistic about the world? Is it getting better or worse? You can just ask them outright. And again, we find in developed countries, if they're less developed countries, they tend to see things as getting better. They can see the progress. But in developed nations, in Western countries, most people think the world is getting worse and not better. I'll name off some of the countries. Denmark, only 8% of people think the world is getting better. In the USA, 6%, Great Britain 4%, Germany 4%, Australia 3%, and France 3%. So again, most people view the world as getting much worse. So you are not alone. I'm not alone. And I know I felt this way and thought this way until I started looking at some of the data. And again, Steven Pinker was the kind of game changer for me that brought it home. This begs the question, why does it seem like the world is getting worse when generally it's not? We just went through all the data, but you're not alone in thinking and feeling like the world is getting worse. I covered this in my previous episode of the root causes of the world's problems. There are many, but I'll say briefly a couple of them here. Why it feels like things are getting worse when really they're not is we have a negativity bias, a built-in negativity bias. This means we're drawn to negative news over positive news. And that's because historically, when we were evolving and we lived in hunter-gatherer tribes for most of our existence, if we missed the bad news that there was a pride of lions at our favorite watering hole, we could be dead. But if we missed the good news that there was an apple tree nearby, we'd likely live to see another day. So we are pre-wired to tune in to negative news over positive news. The media, of course, knows this. So they pump out the negative news nonstop because we can't help ourselves. It's like a candy that we can't help but eating, or potato chips or whatever. Even though we might know it's not the best thing, we're drawn to it like moths to a flame. And we can't exactly blame the media because the media wouldn't be putting the negative stories out there if we weren't looking at them, following them, sharing them, reacting to them. So it gets the eyeballs on the negative news. They're giving us what we want, although, part of us, we don't really want it, but we end up, drawn to it, ironically enough. And because we can see and hear the negative news, and especially with the spread of technology and social media, how easy it is to pump out this negative news nonstop, it seems like the world's going to hell in a handbasket, even when it's not. So that, it's kind of a simple summary of it, but that's what I would say is going on here. And this is a real problem because we are living in a state of fear. The negative news that we keep hearing and seeing makes us fearful of the future for our kids, of America, and each side does this, the left and right. The left gives all this fear about, we'll turn into a fascist state because of the Republicans, and the Republicans, it's fear that we'll turn into a socialist state because of the Democrats. Each one uses fear because fear motivates people to act. They call this negative partisanship, is people are more motivated to vote and to act, not because they love their party so much, it's because they hate and fear the other party. And each one uses negative news to put us in fear of the other side. But living in this state of fear is not good for us. It leads to more polarization and mutual hatred, and that's not good for us. A house divided cannot stand. And I don't think, my view is here at the Reasonably Good Life is our level of fear should match the level of threat. And right now, our fear level is very high, but the actual threat level in general is much lower than we think it is. And that's what, some of those graphs show. We think we're spiraling down the tubes. Even when we look at the data, it paints a much different picture. And it's not good for us to live in such a state of fear. The takeaway from today's episode is that REM was right. It's the end of the world as we know it, but I feel fine. It seems like it's the end of the world as we know it. And generally, most of us feel fine. But that's not good because it puts us in a state of fear, and fear causes some major problems. We are suffering unnecessarily, and the fear creates friction and hatred and the polarization that causes even more suffering. How are we going to work through the challenges of today when we keep blaming each other and we're not seeing things clearly because we're jacked up in a state of fear? I think we can do better, and it's easy for fear to get the best of us, but we need to work. We need to take a deep breath. We need to step back and see reality for what it is. And reality isn't as bad as the news would have us believe. It isn't as bad as each of our tribes would have us believe. Well, there you have it. That was today's episode of The Reasonably Good Life. I've been your host, Dr. Mike Brooks. Be curious, be flexible, be kind, and for goodness sakes, be reasonable. And I hope to see you next time.
Hey, thanks again for joining me today. I want to give a special shout out to Eric Kenow and Patrick Kennedy for their help with both the podcast and YouTube versions of The Reasonably Good Life. If you enjoyed this episode, I always appreciate follows, likes, and shares. Also, if you want to follow me, my website is www.drmikebrooks.com. For Instagram and Twitter, I am at Dr. Mike Brooks. For Facebook, it's Dr. Mike Brooks - The Reasonably Good Life. And for email, you can contact me at contact@reasonablygoodlife.com. Thanks again, and I hope to see you next time.